We're thinking over these weeks of the idea of building, a picture that the New Testament quite often uses for God's work in bringing into existence a new community. It's always nice to see a new building going up, as long as it's not an eyesore and it's not at the bottom of my garden. It's even nicer if you can be confident that that building will still be there throughout its working life, looking good and doing the job it was designed for. And the aspect of building we're thinking of this morning is building security. And we're going to look at some words of Jesus which says that there is no viable threat to the building project on which God is engaged. Because all sorts of things can happen to buildings. And I was reminded recently of two of them. You go up to Chichester Cathedral into the south transept, and there's a little bit of an exhibition, I nearly said exhibition, about the fall of the central spire of Chai Cathedral back in 1861. It's a bit of a scary read, actually, if you've got a bit of imagination and you can put yourself into that building at the time and imagine the courage of many of the people who were doing their utmost to shore it up, in the knowledge that probably it wasn't going to work, and indeed it didn't. It collapsed. And then I took the risk of watching a documentary on Channel 5, because they can either be dire or splendid. And it was about the new building that's been erected on the site of the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center. It described the strength of the central core, the design of the building to cut down the hazards that it could be exposed to, the testing that was done. Every single batch of concrete that was poured was tested, and if it didn't come up to a certain strength, discarded. And at the end they said, this building should survive all conceivable disasters. I hope it never actually is tested, because we said something like that about the Titanic. Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now, this picture is often used in the New Testament and in a variety of ways. Sometimes the idea is of building a single structure, a temple perhaps, sometimes of building a city. And last week we began at the beginning with the reference to the life of Abraham, a man of no fixed address, a nomad, someone who had nowhere here to which he was tied, but whose vision was that God was building a city that has foundations, rather relevant to building security. I remember after the collapse of the spire, they started looking rather critically at the foundations of Chichester Cathedral, discovered that quite a lot had to be done. God is building a city with foundations. He is the architect responsible for the design, and the builder responsible for the contract. And his job is always done with a view to eternity. And then it goes on in the words of Jesus that I alluded to. Jesus has taken his disciples to the area of Caesarea Philippi, away from the throngs in the lakeside towns of Galilee. He's taken them to pause and reflect, and he asks them, who do people say that I am? And they give the answers. But, he says in verse 15 of Matthew 16, what about you? Who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter, no doubt expressing what the others were thinking, says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, in the Greek of the New Testament, Petros. And on this rock, in the Greek, Petra, Jesus is making a play on words, so you have to forgive even preachers when they use puns. Peter, Petros, rock, Petra. On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Sometimes the New Testament says that the foundation is Jesus. Another place it says we're built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. Here Jesus seems to be telling us that Peter, as the confessor of the truth about Jesus, as the one who would first declare the gospel of Christ, as the one through whom Gentiles would first be gathered into the universal church, is the rock on which the church is built. But it's with the remaining words that we're concerned. The gates of Hades will not overcome it. The gates of Hades means the power of death. And when Paul shares with some of his Christian friends the victory of Christ, when he tells them that Christ is now enthroned as the King Messiah, and that he will reign until every foe has been put down, he says, the last enemy to be overcome, to be destroyed, is death. Because the greatest power that opposes God is the power of death. And Christ is building a structure strong enough to withstand the greatest power that can be arraigned against it. I will build, and the gates of Hades, the power of death, will not overcome it. And so he makes a promise of the work that is beginning and is being taken through. But the New Testament gives us something else. Remember when a major civil engineering project is going on, you have all the fences and so on around it to shield what's actually happening from the eyes of the inquiring public. Once upon a time, they used to put little viewing platforms in. Haven't seen so many of those recently, but it was always fun to peer over and look down into the bowels of the earth and see what was happening. But what you do usually find is a great big picture of what the finished building will look like. Okay, it's a pain, it's disrupting traffic. You've got to go to the other side of the road because the sidewalk is no longer there. Oh yes, it looks a mess. There's all that scaffolding. But here's what it'll look like. So at the end of the Bible, we have these words that come at the beginning of Revelation chapter 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. We have the promise in advance. And then we're taken forward a leap into the future. And we see the finished project there before our eyes. And John sees this building. It's a building and yet it's a bride at the same time. He treats us to a detailed description in the chapters that follow. And you soon realize that this is no literal city. A city couldn't possibly be literally like this, but it pictures beauty, value, harmony, unity. This is the new community that God is creating. This is the building project as it will finally be. Beautiful and marked by one thing above everything else, the presence of God and the absence of pain and death and sin and all that mars the life that God meant for his people. A promise and a picture of the realization. But it doesn't always look like that, does it? I will build my church and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. We live in an era where the Christian church in Western Europe is losing ground. At best, in some favoured areas, we're holding our own. We look at the Near East, where the Christian faith began, where Jesus lived out his earthly life, where the apostles preached and taught, where churches were founded. And we fear that in the homeland of Jesus, the church could become extinct. The picture of glory begins to dull a little when you look at the facts on the ground. So what should we do? 3 things, and then I'm done. The first thing is to remember the promises. Jesus said, I will build, and nothing will destroy what I build. He said, I will lay down my life and I will raise it again. And he did. So we've come to know that when he says something, he means it and can be trusted to keep his word. And those promises have sustained people, believers, in worse times. The final fall of Rome, when their world seemed to have collapsed around them. The times coming up to the first millennium were attended by all the nonsense that we had coming up to the second millennium, except that there wasn't all this faff about the year 2000 on our computers. And then, when Christian civilization, as we deemed it, seemed to be threatened by the Ottoman forces advancing across Europe. Again and again, Christians have done a sort of Chicken Little act and panicked. But those that trusted God have held on to the promises. The second thing we can do is take a wider view. When Paul wrote a letter to Christians in Colossae, he talked about this gospel, which all over the world is bearing fruit and growing. Yes, Western Europe, we're at a standstill. But the losses in the Northern Hemisphere are outweighed by the progress in the Southern. Yes, we fear for the long-standing churches of the Middle East. But in that monument of a theocracy which we call Iran, more people are turning in faith to Jesus than ever before because they have discovered that the alternative doesn't work. Yes, in China, Christians have been subject intermittently to savage pressure. But whereas there are 82 or so million members of the Communist Party, there are at least 100 million Christians. People are admitted to the Communist Party of China when they have proved their worth, and they do so because there are present gains. Christians profess their faith in Jesus, knowing that they will lose by doing so, particularly in those circumstances, but having before them the city that has foundations. And lastly, what we can do is to hang on in there. Paul closes his discussion of the resurrection of Christ and of the resurrection of his people with these words: "The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law, but thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." I grew up in Sunday school on a chorus, "On the victory side." Okay, it was trite, but it's stuck in my memory for more years than I like to confess. And that's the point. On the victory side. Therefore, my dear brothers, stand firm. Hang on in there. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. If he is building a church, a structure, a community that is eternal, if there is no power that can destroy it, then whatever we do, however little it seems, is worth doing, because it's a contribution to something that will win. Wherever we are, even in a cause that seems static or losing ground.